Imagine waking up in the same town, at the same sunrise, yet living in a completely different world. One man stretches on soft silk sheets, attended by servants, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Another opens his eyes on a cold, dirt-covered floor, wrapped in tattered clothes, with hunger gnawing at his stomach. Both exist in medieval Europe, but their realities could not be more different. As dawn broke over the medieval town, the contrast between the lives of the poor and the rich became immediately visible. For a peasant, the day began long before the sun fully appeared. The first light barely illuminated the cramped, smoky hut where he slept, often with his family crowded into a single space. The air was thick with the scent of damp straw, unwashed bodies, and animals that shared the hut with him. Sleep was shallow and uneasy, disturbed by hunger, cold, and the awareness of the long day ahead. Every morning was a reminder of survival, a test of endurance and resilience, with no comfort to soften the harshness of reality. Outside the hut, the streets of the village were muddy and uneven. Waste from the homes above was often thrown directly into the pathways, and the sounds of the town crowing roosters, bleating livestock, and the occasional barking dog filled the chilly morning air. Children stumbled barefoot over stones and mud, already aware of the struggles that awaited them in adulthood. For the peasants, breakfast was minimal, often consisting of a slice of coarse bread or a thin porridge made from barley or rye. Many went without any food at all, forced to labor on empty stomachs. The dawn was not beautiful. It was a harsh warning that another day of toil awaited, a day where every hour mattered, and failure could have deadly consequences. Meanwhile, only a few streets away, the wealthy began their day in stark contrast. Nobles awoke in stone chambers lined with tapestries, designed to keep out the cold and provide comfort. Beds were raised off the floor, layered with wool, feathers, and sometimes silk, offering warmth and softness unimaginable to the peasant. Servants quietly opened shutters, allowing golden sunlight to fill the room, and brought fresh water for washing. Clothing had been prepared the night before, clean and fine, ready for the noble to wear. Breakfast was a carefully arranged meal of bread, cheese, fruit, and sometimes meat, served without the noble ever leaving the comfort of his room. The sounds of morning also differed sharply. While the poor heard the harsh cries of animals and the distant bells calling for work, the rich enjoyed quiet, orderly sounds, the soft steps of servants, the clinking of fine dishes, or the gentle rustle of clothing. Time moved differently for each class. The peasants were bound by the sun and the demands of labor, moving with urgency and exhaustion. The wealthy could afford a slow, measured pace, greeting the day with calm and control. Their decisions, plans, and leisure set the tone for the day, while the peasants followed orders, struggling merely to survive. Even the first tasks of the day highlighted inequality. A peasant had to gather firewood, fetch water, and prepare tools for labor in the fields or workshops. Each task demanded physical effort, and mistakes could result in injury or punishment. The noble, by contrast, could review estate matters, plan hunts, or enjoy time with family, all without exerting physical effort. The world seemed entirely divided. The same town produced two different mornings, two different realities, and two entirely different possibilities for life. This early moment at dawn defined the tone for the rest of the day. Hunger, cold, and hard labor awaited the peasant, while warmth, sustenance, and comfort surrounded the noble. Even before stepping outside, the inequity of medieval life was already clear. The first light of day revealed not just the landscape of a town, but the rigid hierarchy that structured every aspect of existence. In medieval Europe, dawn did not symbolize opportunity or hope equally. It marked survival for some and luxury for others, laying bare the deep divide that shaped every breath, every step, and every choice for the rest of the day. The stark contrast of these two mornings illustrated one fundamental truth of medieval life. Your birth determined everything. The same sun rose for both. But their worlds were divided by more than walls or wealth. It was the unyielding force of class, shaping lives from the very first second of daylight. Imagine a world where the next meal could mean life or death. For one man, food is a scarce luxury, barely enough to survive. For another, it is abundance, celebration, and power, flowing freely at every table. In medieval Europe, What you ate defined who you were and often determined how long you lived. In the medieval world, food was more than nourishment, it was a reflection of status, survival, and social hierarchy. For the peasants, daily meals were minimal, monotonous, and unreliable. Most families relied on whatever grains they could grow, often barley, rye, or oats, to make coarse bread and thin porridge. Vegetables such as cabbage, onions, beans, or turnips were occasionally added to soups or stews, but variety was rare. Meat was a luxury that appeared only a few times a year, perhaps during a festival or after an animal had died naturally. Fish might be eaten on special occasions, but even that was limited to those who lived near rivers or the coast. Hunger was a constant companion, shaping not only the body but the daily choices and behavior of the poor. Malnutrition was widespread, leaving children weak and adults prone to illness and exhaustion. Survival was always uncertain, and every meal was a small victory in the relentless struggle of medieval life. The experience of eating for the rich was almost the exact opposite. Nobles, lords, and wealthy merchants enjoyed abundant and elaborate meals. Their tables were laden with roasted meats, beef, pork, venison, and poultry, accompanied by fresh bread, cheese, butter, and fruits imported from distant lands. Sweet pastries, spiced dishes, and fine wines demonstrated both wealth and taste. Unlike the poor, the rich rarely worried about scarcity or hunger. Food was a tool for comfort, indulgence, and status. Large feasts could last for hours, with multiple courses and elaborate presentation. The act of eating itself became a public display, signaling power and privilege to anyone who witnessed it. The contrast in food availability also reinforced social boundaries. Laws often prohibited peasants from hunting or fishing on lands owned by the nobility, with severe punishments for those caught attempting it. Meanwhile, the rich freely hunted deer, boar, and rabbits on private lands, with skilled hunters and servants ensuring a steady supply of meat for the noble household. Even leftovers from noble tables, when shared with servants or the poor, were a reminder of the hierarchy. Small, often insufficient scraps compared to the lavish spreads enjoyed by those at the top of society. Food scarcity among the poor was more than a physical challenge, it shaped entire communities and influenced social dynamics. Villagers often had to ration meals carefully, prioritize children, and work even when weak from hunger. One poor harvest could spell disaster for an entire village, leading to starvation and disease. In contrast, the wealthy were largely insulated from such risks, relying on their lands, laborers, and storage techniques to ensure their table remained full, even in harsh seasons. Access to food, therefore, was a direct measure of power and survival. Even the act of preparing food highlighted inequality. Peasants cooked over open fires, using simple utensils, while the wealthy enjoyed kitchens staffed by trained cooks, using fine tools and carefully sourced ingredients. The smells, sights, and tastes of their meals reflected worlds apart, one dominated by scarcity and struggle, the other by abundance and indulgence. Meals shaped health, lifespan, and social status, creating a stark visual and physical contrast between the classes in medieval towns and villages. In medieval life, food was never neutral. It reinforced social order, determined strength and survival, and highlighted inequality in the most immediate and tangible way. The poor lived in constant fear of hunger, while the rich celebrated their abundance as a sign of power. In this world, every bite mattered, and every meal told a story not just of sustenance, but of life, privilege, and the rigid divisions that governed existence from dawn to death. Imagine working from sunrise to sunset, your body breaking under the weight of survival, while just a few streets away, another man spends the day in comfort, making decisions that affect hundreds without lifting a finger. In medieval Europe, work wasn't just labor, it was a symbol of power, privilege, and class. In medieval life, work defined existence, and the difference between the poor and the rich could not have been more dramatic. For peasants, labor was grueling and relentless. From dawn, they were engaged in backbreaking tasks, plowing fields, carrying stones, repairing roads, tending animals, and harvesting crops. Every action demanded physical endurance and left the body exhausted. Tools were simple, heavy, and often inefficient, offering little relief from the strain. One misstep dropping a load, slipping on mud, or mishandling a tool could result in injury, which was often dangerous in a world with limited medical knowledge. Even minor wounds could fester into life-threatening infections. Fatigue was constant, and rest was brief. The peasants' work dictated not only the day but their very survival, and failure often carried severe consequences, from punishment by local lords to the threat of starvation. The wealthy, however, lived in a world almost entirely removed from such hardship. Nobles, lords, and affluent merchants rarely touched the soil with their own hands. Their days were filled with oversight, planning, diplomacy, and leisure. Estate management, negotiations, and hunting replaced the physical toil that defined peasant life. While peasants labored from sunrise to sunset, the rich could dictate what others did, enjoying the fruits of others' work without the burden of exhaustion. Even dangerous or unpleasant tasks were delegated to servants and laborers, insulating the wealthy from the harsh realities of survival. Their work was measured in influence and decision-making rather than sweat and injury. The psychological contrast was just as stark. Peasants worked under constant pressure. Failing to meet quotas could result in fines, punishment, or eviction. Their lives were dictated by the demands of the land, the weather, and the will of their overlords. Every day brought uncertainty. Will the harvest succeed? Will my family have enough to eat? The wealthy, in contrast, faced pressures of a very different nature. Mistakes could cost money or status, but rarely life itself. Decisions involved strategy, power, and alliances, rather than the immediate threat of starvation or physical injury. The rich navigated risk with resources and protection. The poor navigated risk with nothing but endurance and resilience. The division of labor in medieval society reinforced rigid social hierarchies. The peasants' sweat and toil literally sustained the wealth of the nobility. Every stone lifted, every field plowed, and every crop harvested supported a lifestyle of luxury just a few streets away. Meanwhile, the nobles' leisure and decision-making dictated the peasants' daily routines, creating a system where one class labored to survive while the other lived comfortably and securely. This imbalance was visible everywhere, from marketplaces to manors, and it shaped relationships, power structures, and even morality within the society. Even during leisure hours, the contrast persisted. After long, exhausting days, peasants might rest briefly before returning to chores or tending to personal survival needs, while the rich spent their free time hunting, feasting, or attending social events. The physical exhaustion of the poor contrasted sharply with the mental and strategic engagement of the wealthy, highlighting how privilege allowed life to be experienced in entirely different ways. Work, in this society, was not just a means of survival. It was a reflection of social order and inequality. Ultimately, medieval work revealed the stark reality of class. The poor labored under the weight of survival, their bodies breaking under daily demands, while the rich navigated life with comfort, authority, and safety. Work dictated opportunity, health, and status, illustrating that in medieval Europe, from the first light of dawn to the end of the day, your social class determined not only how you lived but how you labored and what your life could become. Imagine being punished for a crime you didn't even commit, while another man, guilty of the same act, walks free because of his wealth. In medieval Europe, justice was not blind, it was divided by class, favoring the rich and punishing the poor. In medieval society, law and punishment were deeply intertwined with social hierarchy, creating a world where justice was rarely fair. For peasants and commoners, the law was a source of fear rather than protection. Even minor offenses could result in severe consequences. Theft, disputes over property, or stepping on a land that belonged to a noble could lead to fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. Public humiliation and harsh physical penalties were common, intended both to punish the offender and serve as a warning to the community. One misstep could spell disaster not only for the individual but for their family, reinforcing the precarious nature of peasant life. For the poor, The law existed less to protect them and more to maintain order and ensure obedience to those in power. Meanwhile, the wealthy navigated the legal system with a very different experience. Nobles and affluent merchants could often bypass punishment through money, influence, or connections. Crimes committed by the rich were frequently overlooked, excused, or settled with minimal fines. A noble caught poaching on another lord's land could negotiate or pay compensation, while a peasant faced public humiliation or even physical mutilation for the same act. The law functioned as a tool to enforce social hierarchy. It secured the rights and property of the elite while keeping the lower classes in check. Wealth, status, and influence often determined whether one faced punishment or walked free, exposing the stark inequalities baked into medieval society. Power and justice were inseparable. The rich often controlled local courts, appointing officials and judges who acted in their interest. Disputes involving nobles were resolved in ways that favored them, reinforcing authority and expanding their wealth or landholdings. The poor, in contrast, had little recourse, even when a legal decision seemed impartial. The resources, knowledge, and connections of the wealthy often influenced outcomes. Bribes, favoritism, and corruption were common, ensuring that justice consistently protected the powerful. The medieval legal system thus operated less as a mechanism of fairness and more as a reinforcement of social order. Protection under the law further highlighted inequality. Peasants could be assaulted, cheated, or exploited with little hope of retribution, whereas the rich had guards, allies, and legal instruments to safeguard themselves. Even minor disputes could escalate for a noble, resulting in negotiations, fines, or political maneuvering, but rarely personal risk. Conversely, a peasant could lose property, face corporal punishment, or even die as a result of minor infractions. The contrast in protection and consequences underscored the rigid division between classes. Religion and social norms further reinforced these disparities. Clergy often sided with the wealthy, interpreting scripture and local customs in ways that justified the hardships of the poor and reinforced the authority of the elite. The law was framed as moral and divine, but in practice, it ensured that the poor remained subservient while the rich maintained dominance. Punishments were designed to instill fear and obedience in the lower classes, while wealth and influence allowed the upper classes to operate above the same rules. Ultimately, the medieval justice system reflected the broader inequalities of society. For the poor, the law was a source of oppression, fear, and limitation, ensuring that survival itself was fraught with risk. For the rich, the law was a tool of protection and control, maintaining their privilege and power across generations. Justice was not impartial, it was another stage where the divide between rich and poor became painfully clear, reinforcing the social hierarchy from birth to death. In medieval Europe, law and punishment did not merely punish wrongdoing. They defined the lives, opportunities, and freedoms of everyone in the kingdom. Imagine death arriving at your door. One man faces it in a cold, dark hut with little comfort, while another is surrounded by warmth, servants, and ceremony. In medieval Europe, the end of life was as unequal as every other stage of existence. Death in medieval society was inevitable, but the way it arrived and was experienced differed sharply between the poor and the rich. For peasants, death often came suddenly and brutally. Life was fragile, and illness, malnutrition, and accidents were constant threats. Minor injuries or infections problems that could be treated today could easily become fatal. Living conditions were cramped, unsanitary, and filled with smoke and filth, making the spread of disease nearly unavoidable. Access to medical care was minimal, often reliant on local healers, superstition, or herbal remedies of uncertain effectiveness. A simple cut could become gangrenous. A fever could escalate into a life-threatening infection. Death was rarely peaceful for the poor. It came with pain, fear, and sometimes isolation, as families struggled to survive alongside the sick. Children and adults alike grew up knowing that illness or injury could claim life in an instant, and few could rely on comfort or support at their final moments. For the wealthy, however, death was approached differently. Nobles and affluent merchants had access to better nutrition, cleaner living conditions, and trained physicians. Illness could often be delayed or alleviated, and their environment allowed for care and attention that the poor could not access. When death did arrive, it was frequently surrounded by ceremony, attended by family, servants, and clergy. Rituals and funerals were elaborate, showcasing the deceased's status and ensuring their memory and influence were preserved. Wealth and privilege provided a buffer, allowing the rich to approach death with dignity, control, and preparation, in stark contrast to the vulnerability faced by the peasantry. The societal gap extended even to burial practices. A peasant who died might be hastily interred in a mass grave or a simple plot, with little ceremony or remembrance. Records of their passing were minimal, often only noted in passing by local authorities or clergy. Their deaths, though significant to families, were easily forgotten by history. In contrast, the death of a noble could trigger political maneuvering, redistribution of land, and public displays of mourning. Their passing was recorded, remembered, and used to reinforce the social hierarchy. From burial rituals to the marking of graves, death itself became a mirror reflecting the stark inequalities of medieval life. The constant presence of death also shaped the mental and emotional lives of the poor. Awareness of mortality was immediate, personal, and frightening. Every illness, accident, or poor harvest could become a matter of life or death. The wealthy, though not immune to loss, could plan for it, protect themselves with resources, and manage the aftermath. While peasants faced fear and helplessness, the rich exercised control, ensuring that both their lives and legacies remained secure even after death. Even in the symbolic sense, death reinforced social hierarchies. Funerals, memorials, and inheritance practices served to maintain the power and influence of the wealthy across generations. The poor, by contrast, had little opportunity for such continuity. Death was a stark reminder that life itself was unequal, with privilege and poverty shaping not only the day-to-day experience of existence but the final chapter as well. Ultimately, death in medieval Europe was not the great equalizer it is often imagined to be. While every life ended, the journey to that end, the experience of illness, comfort, ceremony, and remembrance, was dictated by social class. The poor faced vulnerability, pain, and anonymity, while the rich enjoyed protection, care, and legacy. From the moment of birth to the final breaths, medieval life from dawn to death was defined by inequality. And even in the face of mortality, the divide between the rich and the poor remained painfully clear. If you enjoyed this journey into medieval life, make sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Don't miss more shocking stories from history that reveal the truth behind life, power, and survival.